The debris field had no name. It was just a patch of dead space, the kind of place where old ships went to cool down and fall apart over a few hundred years. Shattered hulls drifted through it, slow and quiet, spinning in lazy arcs as if they had all the time in the world. There was no light source nearby, and the field sat far from any travel lane. Nobody came out here on purpose. Admiral Seroth of the Valka Dominion came out here because his sensors told him to. He stood on the command deck of the Dominion warship Sovereign Truth and stared at the readings for a long time without saying anything. The deck was clean and quiet. Every console blinked in its proper order. His crew stood at their posts with straight backs and calm faces, which was exactly how Dominion officers were trained to stand. Everything was correct. Everything was orderly. Except for the thing the long-range scanner had found inside the debris field. "Report," Seroth said. His sensor officer, a young male named Veth, pulled up the reading on the main screen. "It came in about 6 minutes ago, Admiral. The object is large, roughly 480 meters in length. It is inside the debris field, near the center. It is not moving." "What kind of vessel?" Seroth asked. "Human construction, sir. We can tell from the hull shape. One of their warship classes, the ones they call heavy cruisers." Veth paused. He looked uncomfortable. "The bow section is missing, Admiral. Roughly the front 40 meters have been sheared away completely. The port side of the ship has a large rupture. Our sensors show it goes all the way through 2 inner decks. There are burn marks across the entire dorsal surface." Seroth looked at the shape on the screen. Even at this distance and resolution it looked wrong. It looked like something that had been through a fire, dragged through gravel, and then left to die. The ship had no bow. Its port side was torn open like a piece of paper. The burn marks were so broad and deep that the original hull color was gone in most places, replaced by the gray-black of heat damage. "Reactor status?" he asked. Veth looked at his screen. He looked at it again. He tapped a key to recalibrate. "The reactor is active, Admiral." A short silence followed. "That ship has an active reactor," Seroth said. "Yes, sir." "A ship with no bow, a hole in its side, and burn damage across its full length has an active reactor." "The readings are consistent. I have rechecked them twice." Seroth said nothing for a moment. He had been in the Dominion Navy for 31 years. He had seen a great many damaged ships. He knew what a ship looked like when it was dying, and he knew what it looked like when it was dead. The object on his screen looked dead. The readings said otherwise. "Send a scout probe," he said. "I want visual confirmation." The probe took 11 minutes to reach the debris field, and another 4 to push through the outer ring of wreckage to get a clear view. When the image came through, Seroth looked at it for a long time. The human ship was even worse up close. The bow was not just missing, it had been blasted away cleanly, and the inner structure of the forward decks was exposed to open space. He could see deck plating and torn conduit and what looked like the remains of a gun mounting. The rupture on the port side was large enough to fly a shuttle through. The hull around it was bent outward, which meant the damage had come from inside, a secondary explosion of some kind. The burn marks covered most of the top and left side of the ship. In several places the outer hull had melted and re-solidified into strange smooth shapes, and yet the reactor was running. "Hull temperature?" Seroth asked. "Within normal range for a ship running on low power, sir." "Life signs?" A longer pause. "Our probes are detecting heat signatures, Admiral. They are faint, and our resolution is limited at this range. But there appear to be living beings inside the ship." Seroth sat back in his chair and looked at the image on the main screen for a while. He was not a man who expressed surprise easily. He had not survived 31 years in the Dominion Navy by showing his feelings to his crew. But something cold moved through him as he looked at the ruined ship and thought about what it meant that there were still living things inside it. He thought about what kind of species kept their ship alive in conditions like that. "Bring us to intercept range," he said, quietly. I want to know more before we do anything else. The Sovereign Truth moved through the dark, heading toward the debris field, and the dead ship that was not dead waited for them without moving. As they drew closer, more sensor data came in. The internal temperature of the ship varied wildly from section to section. Some areas were below freezing. Some were warm. A few were hot, suggesting active systems. The reactor output was lower than it should have been for a ship of that size, but it was stable, which was something no Dominion engineer would have called possible, given the visible damage to the reactor housing. The weapon systems were offline. Life support appeared to be running in partial sections only. One of Sarath's junior officers said quietly, to nobody in particular, that the ship should be dead. Sarath did not reply. He was thinking the same thing. The ship should be dead 3 times over. The bow was gone. The port hull was open to space. The reactor housing was damaged. By every standard of engineering the Dominion used, the UES Unconquerable should have been a cold, drifting piece of wreckage for at least several days, depending on when the battle that caused this damage had taken place. Instead, it sat in the debris field and ran its reactor and kept its people warm. "Try hailing them," Sarath said. Veth looked at him. "We are not at war with humans at this time." "I am aware of that, Veth. Hail them." The communications officer sent a standard contact signal on the open frequency that both species used for neutral communication. They waited. For 11 seconds, nothing happened. Then a voice came through the speaker. It was human, female, rough with exhaustion. The translator turned it into Dominion language almost immediately. "This is Commander Yara Osei of the UES Unconquerable. Who's calling?" Sarath leaned forward slightly. The woman on the other end sounded like someone who had not slept in a very long time. She also sounded, for reasons he could not quite identify, like someone who was not afraid. "This is Admiral Sarath of the Valka Dominion," he said. "We detected your vessel in the debris field. We are approaching to assess your condition. Do you require assistance?" A short pause. Then, "We're fine." Sarath looked at the image of the ruined ship on his screen. He looked at the open bow, at the torn port side, at the burn marks. "You are fine," he said. "Functional," the voice corrected. "That's probably a better word. What do you want, Admiral?" Sarath did not answer immediately. He was still looking at the screen. Something about this situation, about the ship and the voice and the word she had chosen, functional, not fine, not safe, not alive, but functional, made him feel that he was at the beginning of something he did not fully understand yet. "We want to know how you are still here," he said honestly. On the other end of the channel, Commander Osei made a sound. It took the translator a moment to identify it. It was a short, tired laugh. "That's a long story," she said. Sarath did not give her time. He gave her an intercept squadron instead. This was not cruelty. The Valka Dominion was not at war with humans, but it was not their friend either. It occupied a large stretch of space that bordered human territory on 2 sides, and the 2 species had been circling each other carefully for decades, making agreements and then finding ways around them. A damaged human warship sitting deep inside Dominion space, which was where the debris field technically was not something that could simply be left alone. It was a political and military problem, and Sarath was a man who solved problems. He sent 4 ships, not his heaviest, those would have been excessive, but 4 mid-sized combat vessels with full weapons loadouts and experienced crews. Their orders were simple: approach the human ship, assess it fully, and if it showed any sign of aggression, or if it turned out to be more dangerous than it appeared, destroy it. Captain Oren, who commanded the intercept group, had been in the Dominion Navy for 20 years. He had fought in 2 small wars and a border action. He was competent and careful, and he did not rattle easily. He rattled on this mission. The first thing that happened was that its sensors confirmed everything Sarath's long-range readings had already shown. The ship was badly damaged. The bow was gone. The port side was open. The reactor was somehow still running. Life signs inside, 40 or 50 of them, it was hard to say. The interference from the debris field made detailed scanning difficult. The ship was not moving, and its weapons were offline. Oren brought his squadron to within 5 kilometers and hailed the vessel. Commander Osei answered again. Her voice was the same, tired, flat, not afraid. She did not ask what they wanted. She asked, with a kind of irritated patience, whether they were planning to actually do something, or just sit out there and scan her. Oren told her they were here under the authority of the Dominion Navy, and asked her to power down her reactor and prepare to be boarded. A long pause. Then she said, no. Oren gave the order to fire a warning shot. A single pulse from a mid-range energy weapon, aimed well clear of the human vessel, just to establish that his ships were armed and the situation was serious. The human ship did not react to the warning shot. It sat there in the debris field and said nothing for about 30 seconds. Then Commander Osei came back on the channel and said in a tone that suggested she was choosing her words carefully, "If you shoot at my ship again, I will shoot back." Oren almost laughed. The ship had no weapons online. His sensors confirmed it. He had 4 ships to her 1, and her 1 was barely holding together. He fired again, this time closer, a deliberate near-miss off the port side. The response took 4 seconds. Something on the human ship's starboard side lit up. It should not have been able to light up. Oren's sensors showed that the weapon systems on that side had been marked as destroyed or offline. But something lit up anyway, and it fired, and the shot took out the forward sensor cluster on one of his ships cleanly. Not a graze, a direct hit. The crew of that ship was unharmed. The sensor cluster was not. It was simply gone. Oren stared at his screen. "Return fire," he said. "Full spread." What followed was 7 minutes of combat that Oren would spend several weeks trying to explain in his official report. The short version was this. His 4 ships fired at the human vessel many times, and the human vessel kept taking hits and kept firing back, and would not stop. The longer version was stranger. When Dominion weapons hit the open forward section, they caused explosions inside the ship that should have cascaded into the reactor room and killed everyone aboard. They didn't. Post-battle analysis would eventually show that the crew had sealed off the forward sections with emergency blast doors, and then filled the open gap with a mixture of welded hull fragments and dense cargo containers, creating a crude but functional barrier. It was not pretty. An engineer would have looked at it and felt ill, but it stopped the cascade. The portside rupture was similar. It was open to space in some sections, yes, but in others, it had been partially sealed with what appeared to be exterior hull panels from dead ships in the debris field, welded in place from the inside. The welds were rough and irregular. They were also holding. The active weapons were the biggest mystery. Oren's sensors had correctly identified the ship's main weapons as offline. They were offline. What the sensors had not identified, because they had no category for it, was that the crew had rerouted power from 3 non-essential systems into a single functioning secondary battery on the starboard side. The system doing the rerouting was designed for emergency lighting. It was absolutely not meant to carry weapons power. It was doing it anyway. When one of Oren's ships put a solid hit into the starboard side and knocked that battery offline, the human ship was quiet for 90 seconds. Then something else woke up. A weapons mounting near the stern, one that Oren's sensors had marked as structurally compromised, and therefore inactive. It was active. It fired twice, both times accurate, before Oren's ships managed to suppress it again. By this point Oren had lost 2 sensor clusters, had a minor hull breach on one ship from debris kicked up by a near miss, and was beginning to feel a deep professional unease. He called back to Serath. "The vessel is not behaving as a ship of this damage level should behave," he said. Serath's voice was dry. "I noticed. Every time we knock out a system, something else comes online. The crew appears to be rerouting and repairing in real time. Our targeting predictions keep coming back wrong, because the ship's performance keeps changing. A pause. Can you destroy it? A pause. Yes, Admiral. If I am willing to accept the risk of a sustained engagement, we can destroy it. But I want to note that we have already fired on this vessel more times than should be necessary for a ship in this condition, and it is still returning fire. Sarath sat with this for a moment. Hold position, he said. Do not fire unless fired upon. I am coming out there. He arrived 2 hours later on the Sovereign Truth. He brought it in close, within 2 kilometers, and he looked at the Unconquerable for a long time through the visual feeds. He could see the improvised bow barrier now. He could see the rough, ugly patches on the port side. He could see a section of hull near the stern where someone had apparently welded a large flat piece of metal over a crack, and the weld was wide and lumpy and entirely unlike anything a proper shipyard would produce. The ship looked like it had been repaired by someone working in the dock, under fire, with whatever was nearby. It also looked like it was going to keep fighting until there was nothing left of it to fight with. Sarath opened the channel himself. Commander Osei, this is Admiral Sarath. I am asking you to stand down. Her voice came back without much delay. I'll stand down when you stop pointing guns at my ship. You are deep inside Dominion space in a damaged vessel. You are outnumbered. I have enough firepower here to end this conversation in a few seconds. Then why haven't you? She said. Sarath did not answer that immediately, because the honest answer was that he was not entirely sure. Partly it was political. Destroying a human warship unprovoked, even one in Dominion space, would create problems. But partly it was something else, something harder to name. He was curious. He wanted to know how they had done it, how they had kept that ship alive, and he suspected that if he destroyed the Unconquerable, he would never find out. I want to board your vessel, he said, not to take it, to understand it. Another pause, longer this time. Admiral, Commander Osei said finally, I've got 43 people on this ship, and most of them are hurt. We've been holding this bucket together with scrap metal and willpower for 6 days. You want to come see how we did it? Fine. But the first Dominion soldier who points a weapon at one of my crew is going to have a very bad afternoon. Sarath almost smiled. He didn't, because Dominion admirals did not smile on the command deck. But he almost did. Understood, he said. I will come alone. The shuttle bay of the Unconquerable smelled like burning metal and recycled air, and something else, something chemical and sharp, that Sarath could not immediately identify. He had brought no weapons. He had brought no escort. He had, as promised, come alone. Commander Yara Osei met him at the bay entrance. She was a medium-height human woman with dark skin and short hair, and she looked like she had not slept properly in almost a week. There were burn marks on her left forearm, partially treated. She held herself straight, despite what was clearly exhaustion, and she looked at Sarath with eyes that were calm and measuring. Behind her stood 2 human soldiers in light armor. They were armed. They had not pointed their weapons at Sarath, but they had not lowered them either. This was, Sarath thought, entirely reasonable, given the circumstances. Admiral, Osei said. Commander. He looked around the shuttle bay. One wall had a large patch on it, raw metal, not the same color as the original hull, attached with bolts that went through the wall at slightly irregular angles. The floor had scorch marks near the entrance. Several of the overhead lights were out, and had been replaced with portable battery-powered lamps, the kind used during emergencies. You want the tour, she said. It was not a question. I want to understand, he said. She looked at him for a moment. Then she nodded, and turned and began walking. What she showed him in the next 2 hours rewired something in Sarath's thinking. He had been a military engineer before he became an admiral. It was unusual, but not unheard of in the Dominion, and it meant he understood ships in a way that most commanders did not. He knew not just how to use a ship, but how it worked, what its tolerances were, what happened when you pushed past them. and as he walked through the unconquerable, he found himself looking at things that should not exist and should not work, and which existed and worked. The forward section was the first stop. The bow had been blown off by an enemy weapon. Osei explained this briefly, without drama, the way someone describes bad weather, and had taken the forward command center and the primary weapons control with it. The resulting hole was roughly 40 meters wide. They had sealed it. They had sealed it by cutting up 3 cargo containers from the hold, welding the panels together into rough sheets, and bolting those sheets across the open end of the ship, using the ship's own internal repair frame, which was designed for minor hull patches and absolutely not for this. The sheets were not airtight on their own, so they had sprayed industrial sealant over every joint and seam. The kind of sealant meant for small maintenance gaps, applied in quantities so large that the containers of it were now empty and stacked against the wall. Behind the sheets, they had packed the space with more cargo. Everything heavy they had, dense equipment cases and supply boxes, and in one case, an entire auxiliary engine housing they had removed from storage. The whole thing was crude and improvised, and held the ship's atmosphere in without leaking. The sealant was not designed for vacuum pressure differential over a large area, Serat said carefully. No, Osei agreed. Theoretically it should have failed within hours. That's what my engineer said too. She paused. She said it while she was applying it actually. She applied it anyway. Seroth looked at the sealed bow for a long moment. Then he moved on. The portside rupture was next. This one was structural. An internal explosion had pushed the hull outward and cracked 2 of the main support ribs of the ship. Conventional repair doctrine said this made the ship's middle section unstable under acceleration or weapons impact. Dominion engineering standards would have required a dry dock and 3 weeks of work. The crew had run cables, thick ones, the heaviest gauge in the ship's supply, pulled from systems that were already offline. They had run the cables across the rupture from the internal frame on one side to the internal frame on the other side, in a crossing pattern, and tightened them with manual tensioners. It was structurally the equivalent of strapping a broken bone with tape. It was not a real repair. It was a way of telling the physics of the situation that you disagreed with them, and were going to fight. The broken hull section had not collapsed. The cables were holding. There were 17 of them. You reinforced a structural failure with cable tensioners, Serat said. My chief engineer said the math almost worked out. Almost. She was optimistic, but the ship held. The weapon systems were the part that Serat spent the most time on. He had a full list of what his sensors had shown as offline before and during the engagement, and he compared it against what he was seeing. Most of the primary weapons were genuinely gone, either physically destroyed or damaged beyond operation. But in 4 separate locations the crew had done something that Dominion engineers would have called illegal under their own safety standards. They had taken power conduits from life support backup circuits, environmental controls, and in one case the ship's backup navigational array, and they had physically spliced them into weapons power lines. The splices were done by hand, with manual tools, insulated with whatever material was available. He saw sections wrapped in rubber tubing meant for fluid lines, sections covered in heat-resistant tape, one section where someone had used an insulating polymer meant for electronic component storage. The weapons they powered were not the main batteries. They were secondary mounts, smaller, designed for point defense, but they were online, and they could fire. Running weapons power through life support conduit is, Serat started. Dangerous, yeah, Osei said, but the life support in those sections was already down, so we weren't giving up anything we still had, and we needed the guns. He stood in the corridor and looked at one of the splices. It was messier than anything he had seen outside of a disaster scenario. It was also functional. He could see the power reading on the small gauge that someone had taped to the wall nearby. Handwritten numbers on paper tape, updated in pen. Someone had been tracking the power draw manually. Who did these, he asked. Mostly Petty Officer Vasquez, Osei said. She did the forward ones. The ones back near the stern were done by Technician Park and a kid named Reyes, who was 18, and had been on a ship for 4 months before this. An 18-year-old with 4 months of experience had jury-rigged a weapon system from life support conduit during an active battle, and it had worked. Serath stood quietly for a moment and thought about the engineers in his own fleet. They were trained to the highest Dominion standard. They knew the manuals. They knew the tolerances. They would never have done any of this. Not because they lacked courage, but because every part of their training told them that what had been done here was impossible, and so they would not have thought to try it. The humans had apparently not been told what was impossible. Or they had been told, and had decided that impossible was a starting point for negotiation. He saw the handwritten damage log near the end of the corridor. Actual paper, taped to the wall next to a damaged console, covered in pencil marks and amendments, and small drawings that appeared to be quick sketches of which conduit went where. It was a record of 6 days of improvised repair, updated continuously, a running argument with catastrophe, written in the handwriting of at least 4 different people. He stood in front of it for a while. "You should have died," he said. He did not mean it as an insult. He meant it as an observation, the way a scientist might say an experiment should have failed. "We know," Osei said. "We kept dying and then not dying. After the 3rd time, you kind of stop expecting it to stick." He looked at her. She looked back at him. She was tired and burned, and her ship was held together with cable and sealant and spite. And she did not look like someone who felt she had done anything particularly remarkable. That, Serath thought, might be the strangest part of all of this. It was Serath's political officer who ruined things. His name was Coordinator Heth, and he had been assigned to the Sovereign Truth 6 months ago by the Dominion High Council to ensure that all field decisions had proper political oversight. He was not a military man. He did not understand ships or battles, or the particular kind of calculus that a commander had to do in the field when the situation was strange and the right answer was not in any manual. He understood territory and precedent and what the High Council would think. While Serath was aboard the Unconquerable, Heth sent a message to the Council. The message said, in short, that a human warship had been found inside Dominion space and was being uncooperative, and that he believed a full boarding action and seizure of the vessel was the correct political response, as it would establish Dominion authority over the incident and prevent the humans from claiming any territorial precedent. The Council agreed. By the time Serath returned to the Sovereign Truth, the orders were waiting for him. He read them twice. Then he called Heth into his office and explained in precise and measured language exactly what he thought of the orders and of Heth personally. This had no effect on the orders, which were from the High Council and therefore final. He called Commander Osei and told her what was coming. He did not have to do this. He was not sure why he did it. He told himself it was because he wanted to give her the chance to surrender peacefully and avoid casualties. She said, "How long do I have?" He told her 2 hours before the boarding force arrived. She said, "Okay," and closed the channel. The boarding force was 48 soldiers from the Dominion Standard Military Police Division, chosen because they specialized in ship seizure operations. They were equipped with full body armor, energy weapons set to stun for the first stage of the operation, and small cutting tools for getting through sealed doors. Their commander was a hard-faced officer named Sub-Captain Dren, who had done this kind of operation 11 times before. They breached the Unconquerable through the port side rupture, which was the largest opening and the most direct route to the ship's interior. Dren sent 6 soldiers through first to establish a position, then began bringing in the rest. The first 6 soldiers made it about 12 meters into the corridor before they ran into the first obstacle. It was a forklift, not in the sense of a weapon, in the sense that someone had driven a cargo forklift into the corridor, and then apparently removed its wheels and welded it to the deck. It sat across the full width of the passage, with its lifting forks extended and its chassis bolted down, completely immovable, blocking forward movement entirely. There was a gap above it, about 60 centimeters, and a human face appeared in that gap and told the 6 soldiers, in very plain language, that they should go back. Dren ordered them forward anyway. They could fit through the gap if they went one at a time, slowly. It was a choke point, not an absolute barrier. The second obstacle was a fire suppression line. The ship's fire suppression system used a compressed chemical agent stored under high pressure throughout the vessel, released through nozzles in the ceiling in emergencies. In the corridor on the other side of the forklift, the crew had manually removed several of the nozzle heads and replaced them with bare pipe ends connected to valve controls at the end of the corridor. When the 4th Dominion soldier came through the gap over the forklift, someone opened a valve. The compressed chemical was not toxic. It was a fire suppressant. But it came out at high pressure in a dense white cloud that filled the corridor in seconds and dropped the temperature sharply and hit exposed skin like a cold slap. It was disorienting, blinding, and loud. 3 soldiers fell. 2 more retreated back through the gap. The 4th was grabbed from behind by human hands and dragged backward into the cloud. And what happened to that soldier was unclear for several minutes because nobody in the corridor could see anything. The soldier was later found secured with cargo strapping to a pipe on the far wall, unharmed, but very cold and very unhappy. Dren pulled his team back to the breach point and reassessed. He had expected, based on his briefing, to be walking through a damaged ship with a small, exhausted crew that had limited capacity to resist. He had not expected a forklift welded to the deck. He had not expected a repurposed fire system used as a crowd control weapon. He was beginning to understand that the 2 hours Commander Osei had been given had been used very productively. He split his force. 1 group at the main port rupture, 1 at a smaller maintenance hatch on the dorsal surface, 1 attempting to enter through the open bow section from outside using climbing gear. He would take the ship in 3 places at once, overwhelm the defenders with numbers. The dorsal hatch team made it inside and reached an intersection before they found the 2nd forklift, which had been deployed differently, turned sideways and raised, blocking the junction completely, with cargo containers stacked behind it and a very determined human sitting on top of them with a fire extinguisher, which turned out to be a surprisingly effective close-quarters weapon when swung with sufficient commitment. The bow team found that the improvised barrier Osei's crew had built to seal the hull was from the outside, essentially a solid wall of welded metal and dense cargo. They had cutting tools. They began cutting. Someone inside the ship heard them and began cutting from the inside in the opposite direction, and then welding as fast as they cut. And the 2 sides went back and forth for 20 minutes until the cutting team's power cells ran low. Dren, in the main corridor, pushed forward again after the fire suppression cleared. His soldiers moved carefully, in full helmet seal, lights on. They passed the forklift, got through the cloud zone, pushed deeper into the ship. They found that many of the internal doors had been removed from their mounts and used as barricades, and that the corridors had been changed, panels pulled from walls to narrow passageways, sharp corners created where the crew had dragged equipment into new positions, forcing Dominion soldiers to slow down and bunch up in places where they could not use their numbers effectively. The lighting was gone in most sections, and the human crew was clearly moving in the dark with far more ease than the Dominion soldiers, because they knew where everything was. In one corridor, 3 soldiers rounded a corner and walked into a hanging arrangement of sharp metal fragments from the destroyed bow section, strung at face height on wire, which clattered and slashed and startled them badly enough that all 3 fired wildly at walls before getting control of themselves. Nobody had been standing behind the sharp metal fragments. They were just there to slow things down. Sub-Captain Dren sat down in the middle of the port corridor, surrounded by a ship that was continuing to defeat his force in ways that would have seemed comic if they did not hurt so much, and called Sereth. "Admiral," he said, "the situation is not progressing as expected." Sereth, listening from the Sovereign Truth, said, "I see that." The crew has modified the interior of the ship into an environment that significantly advantages their own movement while impeding ours. Yes. They have also removed several fire suppression systems and weaponized them, and at least 2 forklifts have been permanently attached to corridor floors. I am aware. I have taken 11 casualties, Admiral. None are serious. All are somewhat embarrassing. A pause. Then Sarath said, "Pull your people out, Dren. All of them. Leave the ship." Dren looked around at the dark corridor and the welded forklift and the jury-rigged obstacles that an exhausted crew of 43 had built in 2 hours to stop 48 trained soldiers. "Yes, Admiral," he said, gladly. The full withdrawal took 40 minutes. Sarath watched it from the Sovereign Truth and said nothing. Heth, the political coordinator, came to the command deck and said several things, none of which Sarath responded to, and eventually Heth left again. When the last Dominion soldier was back aboard his ship, Sarath opened the channel to the Unconquerable one more time. "Commander Osei, my forces are clear of your vessel. We will not attempt another boarding." A pause. Then her voice, still flat, still tired. "Okay. I want to say something, and I want you to understand that I mean it plainly, without politics." "Go ahead." "What your crew has done with that ship is unlike anything I have encountered in 31 years of service. I do not say this to flatter you. I say it because it is true, and because I think you should know that it has been seen and understood, not just by me." A longer pause this time. Then, "Thank you, Admiral." Her voice had changed slightly. Still tired, but something else in it now, something quieter. "We just did what we had to do." "That may be," Sarath said, "but what you had to do was impossible, and you did it anyway. There is a difference." He closed the channel and gave the order to withdraw. The Dominion fleet moved away from the debris field in clean formation, their ships undamaged and fully functional, having comprehensively failed to take a half-destroyed human warship that had been through 6 days of battle and was being held together by cable and sealant, and people who refused to let it die. The report took Sarath 3 days to write. He was a careful man and a thorough one, and he wrote the way he commanded, methodically, with attention to every detail, making sure that nothing important was left out. The final document was 7 pages long. 6 of those pages were data, sensor readings, engagement records, detailed technical analysis of the Unconquerable's improvised systems, broken down component by the engineers aboard his ship, who had spent 2 days going over everything they had observed, and come back shaking their heads and using words like impossible and unprecedented, and we cannot account for this. The engagement log showed exactly how many times the Unconquerable had been hit, what systems had been targeted, what should have happened, and what actually happened instead. The numbers did not agree with each other, and Sarath included both sets without attempting to reconcile them, because he thought the gap between what the numbers said should happen and what had actually happened was itself the most important piece of information in the report. The final page was 1 paragraph. Sarath had written it last, after the 6 pages of data, and he had rewritten it 4 times before he was satisfied. It said, "The UES Unconquerable was encountered in an advanced state of structural and systems damage that would have rendered any Dominion vessel non-functional. The human crew had maintained reactor operation, partial weapons capability, and active life support through methods that violate accepted engineering tolerances and which our engineers assess as having had a low probability of success. These methods worked. The crew further demonstrated, during a boarding action conducted by 48 trained soldiers, the ability to convert a damaged ship interior into a defensive environment in under 2 hours using only materials on hand. The boarding action was unsuccessful. Based on this encounter, I submit the following assessment for the record. The greatest danger posed by human forces is not their weapons or their ships. It is the fact that their crews do not appear to recognize a situation as hopeless. This removes from our calculations the most reliable factor we have when assessing an engagement, the point at which a rational opponent accepts that the outcome is decided. I recommend that all Dominion commanders who may encounter human vessels in contested conditions treat every human ship as fully combat capable, regardless of visible damage, and that no engagement with a human crew inside their own vessel be considered low risk at any level of apparent disadvantage to the humans. They will find something to fight you with. They always do. The High Council received the report and debated it for 4 days. The political faction, led by people like Coordinator Hef, thought it was alarmist. The military faction thought it was accurate. The engineering division read the technical analysis sections and called an emergency meeting of their own that lasted 2 days and resulted in a secondary document recommending the review of all Dominion assumptions about damage tolerance thresholds. New doctrine was drafted within a week. It was called, in the dry language of military policy, Engagement Protocol Amendment 7C, Non-Standard Vessel Assessment. Its practical effect was to tell every Dominion commander in careful formal language what Sereth had put more plainly in his report. Do not assume a human ship is finished because it looks finished. Do not assume a human crew is beaten because they should be beaten. And do not, under any circumstances, try to take a human ship by boarding, unless you have overwhelming numbers, a very long time, and no particular attachment to your dignity. The protocol became standard within the year. It was the only Dominion military doctrine update in 40 years to be adopted without opposition from any faction in the Council. None of this reached Commander Osei immediately. A human rescue team found the Unconquerable 8 days after the Dominion fleet withdrew, responding to a signal beacon she had set off when her communications array finally came partly back online. The ship was under tow within 24 hours. It took 4 tugs to move it safely, and the engineers who came aboard to assess it stood in the corridors for a long time and said very little, and looked at the improvised repairs with expressions that combined horror and deep respect in roughly equal parts. The voyage home took 3 weeks. Osei spent most of it sleeping, eating, and writing her own report, which was considerably shorter than Sereth's, and focused mostly on the engineering decisions made by her crew during the 6 days in the debris field. She wanted the record to show whose names belonged to which repair, which idea, which decision: Petty Officer Vasquez's wiring work, Chief Engineer Diaz's structural cable solution, Technician Park and 18-year-old Reyes, and the weapons power reroute that had kept them fighting when they had no right to be fighting. On the last day of the journey, when the home station was visible on the forward displays, and people were finally beginning to laugh and talk too loudly, the way people do when the danger is really truly past, Osei went out through an airlock in a patched EVA suit, and sat on the outer hull of the Unconquerable, and looked at the stars. The hull was cold and rough beneath her. The patchwork was visible all around her, the ugly welds, the mismatched metal, the places where things didn't quite line up. From out here, you could see all of it clearly. You could see every sign of what the ship had been through and what had been done to keep it alive. She was thinking about coffee, specifically about a mug of it in the station cafeteria, which would be hot and real and would not taste like recycled ship water. She had been thinking about that mug for about 4 days now. She did not know that 700 light-years away, a Dominion admiral was finalizing a report that would change the way the most powerful military in the sector thought about human beings. She did not know that engineering divisions were meeting in emergency sessions because of what her crew had done with cable and sealant and refuse from dead ships. She did not know that her name and the name of her ship had already become the kind of name that gets mentioned in briefings and training sessions and quiet conversations among officers who think carefully about what a war with humans